I did want this to be short, and it ended up being a bit longer. And it also made a lot of sense when I wrote it, and I've just read it again, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure it does make sense. So I'm really happy to take questions if there's something you go, no, that's wrong. And Trevor will answer them. What I thought I would do is just take a few minutes to look at the Eucharist, the setting up, the Eucharistic prayer, the setting up of the bread and wine and turning them into something sacramental, and begin to look a little bit at the way that developed and why we do certain things that we do. The question I want you to ask yourselves as I chunter on is, during that Eucharistic prayer, at what point does that very ordinary unleavened wafer and that wine that we got from Tesco's or wherever we got it, at what point does that begin to become something sacramental? Are the bits that we could or couldn't miss out? So in those very early days, immediately after the death of Jesus, the thing that we call communion, Holy Communion, was then called the Lord's Supper. And it would seem that it was more of a shared meal than a sort of symbolic wafer and a little sip of wine. And let me just quote from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Just a quick reminder, Paul set up this community in Corinth, which is, I think, on the Greek coast, is it? Yeah. Corinth at that time was a very lawless seaport. It's full of thieves and brigands and all sorts of interesting ladies. And Paul was reminding his congregation, don't backslide into the inns and pubs and interesting life, but keep true to the Lord. And he says to them, now, in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. But to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry, and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you. Now, the idea of communion as a shared meal is represented today in the consecration part of the prayer. So that's the bit where the priest says, on the night before he died, he had supper with his friends, and he ends it saying, do this in remembrance of me. And it's a symbol of when Christ, as we heard in this morning's gospel, Christ takes the bread and the wine and he passes it around, and he said, take, eat, do this. Now that begins to change, or develop, I guess you'd say, as time passes. So the Gospels, as you know, were written a few years after Paul wrote his letters. So Paul probably wrote his letters about 40, 50 AD. And the Gospels began to be written about 60, 70 AD. I'm right there, aren't I? Yeah. The Gospel writers wrote in Greek. And so instead of the Lord's Supper, they used this word Eucharist. And Eucharist means thanksgiving. And it's at this point that the celebration begins to include not just this idea of a shared meal, but some technicality. So, for example, you'll see, priests sometimes do it differently, but when I do it, there's a major part of the ceremony which has actions, and there's this bit called the Epic Thesis. I'm not going to test you, it's okay. A bit called the Epic Thesis, which is where I ask God to send down the Holy Spirit onto the bread and wine, and then I bless it. So I go, send down your Holy Spirit, that this bread and wine may be for us. Yeah? So that's the Epic Thesis, and it's a technical part. Now I don't know what sort of role the church leader would pray during that Lord's Supper, but it's pretty clear during the Eucharist, that development, that the priest is playing a very important part. especially if he's speaking in a different if he's speaking in a different language to the congregation. So supposing he's speaking in Latin and you all speak English. So in that case, it's extremely unlikely the congregation would have any idea about what's going on. And so there's a danger that the priest can be seen as some sort of magician casting a spell on the bread and wine. And that was one of the driving forces behind the Reformation during the reign of King Henry VIII, when he took all the powers away from the church and ransacked them of all their goodies and said, keep it to the very simple, but more important, have the services in English. If you have it in English, everyone understands what's going on. And he said, instead of this technical term Eucharist, we call it Holy Communion, this coming together as a community. Now the thing is, if we have it in English, it's not just me who's able to speak, but you are also able to speak. And so we can include the prayer, which we call the prayer of humble access. And that's the bit towards the end when we say, we do not presume to come to this your table, merciful Lord. And we're saying, as a people, we are just not really all that good, but we know that you'll forgive us for all the mistakes and errors that we make. Notice in this prayer, we say, we. Something about equality. I'm not saying you, I'm not saying I, we are saying we. We are a shared community. So, Lord's Supper, Eucharist, Holy Communion, they all mean the same thing. They're all completely interchangeable, but each one invites us to think about a different element of that Eucharistic prayer. So, I go back to my original question. At what point does simple bread and wine outpoured become something sacramental? Is it at the point of consecration? The recognition of Jesus saying on the night before he died, he came to supper with his friends. Jesus doesn't say that. On the night before he died, he came to supper with his friends. Is that the point it changes? Is it the Epic Thesis? Send down your Holy Spirit. Is that the point? Is it when the bread is broken bread and wine outpoured? Or is it the part we all share, the prayer of humble access? We do not presume to come. Now, in all honesty, I don't know. And it's something that's debated. But I think maybe the important thing is that we're all here together, sharing, worshipping, and celebrating.
If I may add, it's a point which is very important to us at the moment, because we're approaching a time when we won't have an ordained minister to lead us. And from a personal point of view, it's what you, as you call the Epic Thesis, your ability to bless the offering, that will remove the symbolism of the for me. And it's what we do with that time that we will have when there will not be a meaningful Eucharist. They're like the St. Martin's congregation to think about. I'm going to ask them now to think about what we can do with that time. Because there will come a time very shortly when we won't have an ordained minister. From a personal perspective, the Epic Thesis, your ability to bless the offering, is the key to the meaningfulness of the Eucharist.
Yeah. Which is a bit sad, really, because you and I did identical training. I'm allowed to do that, and yet we wrote the same essays, and I don't know the answer. I think I go to the sharing. The communion is about sharing together, and if it's not sharing the sacrament, which I think that's so important. But the next best thing is sharing this amazing community that you are. Yeah, I think it's amazing.